Hi, everybody. Welcome. This is Laura Hendrickson from Life of Volleyball. Today, I have Kent Steffes with me, and we're so excited to have you. You've just produced your new book, Kings of Summer. And today, we'll be doing an interview with you, just talking about the book and all the good stuff around the development of it and the idea around it, just your experience in producing this amazing book. So I'm super excited to share that with our folks and the world and help people understand just the beautiful thing that beach volleyball is. So with that, I'll just let you introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself and some key highlights you'd like to let people know that don't know you or haven't read all about your successes in life. And but I'm super honored to be here with you and really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for having me. And hello, all the world, the volleyball world, especially. So, my name is Kent Steffes. And along with my writing partner, Travis Mewhirter, we wrote a book. It's called Kings of Summer. You can see it backwards. It's funny. But it's available on Amazon. And it details the rise of beach volleyball from this rebel sport back in the 70s to what became an Olympic sport and one of the most popular Olympic sports in the summer games.
Yeah.
And there was kind of an epic match in the quarterfinals of that Olympics in 1996 in Atlanta between Karch Kiraly and myself and Sinjin Smith and Henkel that we detail. So if anybody's interested in the sort of history of beach volleyball and that particular first Olympics, I go to Amazon and check it out. So as you might imagine, I was a beach volleyball player. I started my career as a professional in 1988, South Padre Island, with a guy named Owen McKibben. If you're volleyball fans, his nephews, the McKibben brothers, put out a lot of interesting content on their YouTube channel as well. And I eventually rose up into the ranks. I'll give a couple of my accomplishments. I don't mean to brag, but it certainly makes me feel happy when I say these things. So I was the youngest number one player in the history of the sport. I became number one at a very young age. I won about 110 tournaments. I won the first gold medal in the Olympics with my partner Karch Kiraly in 1996. And I have the highest winning percentage of any beach volleyball player in the history of the sport. So I won just under 50% of the tournaments I played in. I'm really proud of that. We won 13 in a row with Karch Kiraly. That's a good, it's kind of difficult to win 13 beach volleyball tournaments in a row because you're playing on this beach and that beach and in this weather condition and that weather condition. So I'm very proud of those accomplishments. And so that's sort of my quick background in my career.
Yeah, no, it's very good. I will be linking an article that covers some of that topic because I found one on you earlier. So I read that in the comments below the video here. When you decided to make this book, what really inspired you to write it?
So there's the two things that happen that kind of simultaneously come together. Beach volleyball in the 90s was it was enormous. It was big. We had hundreds of thousands of fans that would come to our tournaments. We were live on NBC with millions of viewers. And literally since that time period in the 90s, volleyball has never in the United States gotten to that level, that big. Actually, you can see some of these pictures on the back of my wall. That's Hermosa Beach there. And that's another Hermosa Beach. And if you compare that to the Hermosa Beach Open that they played a couple of weeks ago, it was bigger, larger. There was more prize money involved. There was more sponsors involved. There was an entire volleywear industry that was like hundreds of millions of dollars. People were wearing the clothes that we wore. So there's always a bit of a nostalgia about that period. What happened, what was going on. As we talk about in the book, it rose from this rebel sort of like anti-authoritarian bunch of people. We were rather loud and raucous and crazy. We said nutty things that got everybody all excited. And, the biggest thing on the weekend of a tournament was the player party where everybody would go drinking and have a crazy time. And it was spring break in Florida. Yeah. So, I think there's just a lot of nostalgia for the 90s. And ever since those times in the 90s, I get about 5 or 10 people reaching out to me who want to write a book about what happened in the 90s, want to do a documentary about the 90s. In the last couple of years, we'll do a Netflix series. And, it would be great if a lot of those people did it, but most of those conversations never really amounted to anything. There was a couple groups who tried to do a documentary. One group did a GoFundMe page, tries to raise a little money. And I kind of realized that my time wasn't really well spent by interacting with these 5 to 10 people every year. They want to have meetings, they want to talk about it, and I kind of thought that it was never going to happen. And so I would tell them, I would simply say to them, like, look, I'll be your last interview, right? So get your documentary, do your book, interview all your people, write it all, come to me last, in a sense. And they kind of came off sounding a little bad. But anyway, so if you remember, everyone remembers the pandemic, okay? The pandemic hits in the United States and they shut everything down.
Yeah.
And, there was different things that happened across the country. Some states were a little bit more open than others. Well, Los Angeles, we were one of the worst. It was lockdown, no restaurants, no movie theaters, nothing, no bars. People didn't want to socialize with each other. My beach club that I belonged to down at the beach was closed. And, I now I work for home. I work in finance. I run a hedge fund. So after work, I usually like to go out. Well, there's nothing to do. So I found myself with absolutely nothing to do and bored out of my skull. And I started to just write some articles on Facebook, write articles about winning, about mental, physical, and emotional strength, writing stories about my life and times as a beach volleyball player. And I got a really good feedback from it. And it wasn't anything I thought I would do anything with. Again, I was just on Saturday mornings and Sunday mornings just to fill the day during the pandemic. I just started writing. And so I got binged by Travis Mewhirter, who is good young man. He's he's 30-ish, and he's a professional beach volleyball player, and he's a writer. So he's one of probably the premier writers in volleyball right now. He writes for Volleyball Mag, he writes for the AVP, he writes for Volley World, and he's just a really nice guy. And he, of course, contacted me and said, "Hey, can I talk to you about this book I'm writing on beach volleyball?" And I was like, "Well, I'll be your last interview." Okay. And in my entire time, 22 years, nobody has ever hit me up on that until he did. Wow. So he says, "Here's my book." And he sent me, first he said, "Hey, do you mind if I use some of the things that you wrote about in your Facebook page? Do you mind if I use that in my book?" I'm like, "Yeah, sure. Go ahead." Right. That's fine. Do what you want to do. It's not a big deal to me. Then he goes, "Here's my book. I'm ready for the last interview." And he had written a complete sort of story, which was the foundation for our book, Kings of Summer.
Yeah.
And I said, "All right." I said, "Come on over for dinner." So he and his wife, Delaney, who's also a professional volleyball player. She actually was the assistant coach at Pepperdine women's sand volleyball team. And we had Sinjin Smith and Patty Smith, Sinjin's wife, at this dinner I had at my house with Travis. And we sat there. I said, "Well, what do you want to know? Here's your last interview."
Yeah.
And so we had a good night, and Sinjin was there too. And we talked about the time period. And it was a couple days later when he said to me, he goes, "Kent, it's something about it. Like, about that time period in a way that I can't grasp, not have been there. I can read articles about it. I can interview people, but you just sort of have a depth of knowledge about that period, which I think would be great." He goes, "Would you like to co-write it?" And I'm like, "Sure, why not?" Nice. So along with my other many accomplishments in life, I am now a published author, which makes me excited. So if I sell one book or 200 books, it doesn't matter. I'm a published author, right?
Oh, that's great.
And so, so we talked about the book, we talked about things, and I was able to provide a perspective and an experience that was added a lot to the book. But more importantly, is the book has stories about a lot of different people: Sinjin Smith, Randy Stoklos, Tim Hovland, Mike Dodd, Chris Marlowe, Pat Powers, Carlos Briceno, Jeff Williams. You'll just, when you read this book, you'll read a lot of their stories. And one of the interesting things is that, we kind of re-interviewed some of them. Mm-hmm. And because I was there, I was able to get sort of a depth. Well, this is what we say in the book. Like, we knew the truth when we found it, right? Because I knew the right questions to ask. Right. Not everybody agrees on everything. Everybody's got a different perspective. But what happens is people have a perspective, then they layer it on top of the story. And I was able to go, look, that's not really what happened. Like, what happened? Like, what were you really, like, what was really going on? Yeah. We interviewed Doug Beal. Like, because there was one of the biggest things in volleyball at the time was the tension on the national team. And we could talk about this in this interview when they developed the national training centers for USA Volleyball, and the tension between the players and the coach, and how they just, they got removed off the team and went to beach volleyball. Mm-hmm. And so, there's this person has this perception, this person has this perception, but then again, they go like, oh, he's a jerk, or he's a jerk, or this guy sucked, or this guy. I'm like, really, what was going on?
Yeah. And I'll just tell the audience as well. I've been in volleyball for 40 years. Mm-hmm. And I started when I was 9 and went through the whole club, junior college, won some awards. So I was really in the heat of it in the 80s when everybody was playing, and I would visit State Beach, and I got to meet Sinjin and Randy back in those days. I got to work at Volleyball Monthly magazine.
Oh, wow.
I proceeded to go through that CBVA rite of passage, and mm-hmm. At one point did win a AAA and did end up playing pro for 3 years myself, and just in amongst all of these historic things, all of us have these different perspectives, and from my perspective, I saw a lot of the egos, and unfortunately those egos were kind of possessive of, okay, well, if you're on the AVP or if you're on the WPVA, you can't play anywhere else. We want you as individuals. And they really closed off that opportunity to play on both, like you couldn't play on both Stanford and the beach.
Yeah.
And that's a shame, because it ultimately with Karch, he played indoor, he played outdoor. He is now this entity, as you said, he becomes super Karch, and steps it up, because he's, and like you in your background, you were able to play in so many different environments and so many different angles of your game to be able to have the success that you've had. And so, just in that perspective, and even with AVP now, it's like, okay, well, is this really working? And, somebody knows or looks at the AVP, it looks like it's wonderful, but it's at the same time, there's some underlying things that I see in watching the sport for so many years, where I would love to say, hey, slap a wristband on everybody that comes, because they're going to show that they support the sport. And yes, charge them $15 or $20 just to walk around, because they're professional athletes, and they're the most amazing athletes out there. So that little snippet on me, but that's, and I to your point, I see it just from a different perspective, and just watching everything and watching the sport evolve as it is. And so part of Life of Volleyball is really looking at how do we create this opportunity for people to play for their entire life, because it is such a great game. You can play it at all different levels, and interviewing people like you that have been in the sport for so long and know the ins and outs. I'm excited to build these connections and relationships so that we can nurture the foundation of the sport it can really explode even more than it is.
Yeah.
What would you say would be the most important thing around, learning this information from the book?
Say that again. Most important thing about?
We're sharing our history.
Yeah.
We're sharing the experience of that. And as a reader, obviously it's an entertainment factor, and it's seeing kind of from an inside viewpoint. But importance-wise, like, is that something that you want to instill in people so that they want more, they want to come back, they want to regrow it to that level? Like, what do you feel like would be as an important message to get from the book?
God, I mean, if they wanted to grow it the way it was back then, they can certainly do that. My perspective is that it doesn't seem to me that they want to. So if that's what the players wanted to do, they could sort of work to get that. The book does tell the story of how you look. In 1976, Wilk and Matsuoka, two former marketing directors at Yamaha, created the sport of professional beach volleyball. Okay, they created a sport. You could do that back then. It was before all the massive money came into sports marketing, before I like Mike Jordan, like the Nike deal that he did. And so they said, hey, we're going to create a professional sport and we're going to call it the World Championships of Beach Volleyball. Right. And they got a $5,000 sponsorship from a beer company. And boom, the next thing you know, they're doing, 10 to 12 tournaments, and they have Miller Brewing Company and Jose Cuervo. And there was some conflict with the players, which we talk about. There are players, we complain about everything. So the ball wasn't good enough. The prize money wasn't enough. More. Athletes tend to be very, hard charging, and the high that we are, how would I put this? We are very comfortable in high conflict environments. So we don't really have a problem with that.
What, are we competitive or what? No.
A little bit, right? Yeah. You don't want two athletes going at each other, because if they can't resolve it on the court, it gets to be a little dicey.
Well, that's why volleyball's so great. You just hash it out on the court, man.
Yeah. But, when you're talking about these business things, you can't, line up the volleyball. So the AVP was formed, the Players Association was formed, and they took control of the sport, and they grew it to heights that were unimaginable. And, then of course it went bankrupt, and a for-profit entity got involved. So the AVP is a for-profit entity. And that before, the AVP was a nonprofit entity. And there are certain, after I was done with my playing days, I went to business school. I went to Stanford Business School, and I have an MBA. Right, it's one of the top business schools in the country. So I now know things and the words to use in order to sort of communicate this better. But when you have a for-profit entity in something which should probably be a nonprofit, there's certain problems that develop in that, and that's sort of some of what you're seeing there. So the book is a blueprint for how to build a sport, how to start a sport, how to build a sport, how to grow a sport, and the conflicts that occur and how those conflicts get resolved, which I think, anybody who reads it would find very interesting.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, that's kind of a hidden gem that I don't think most people would realize unless we discussed it here. So thank you. In doing the book with Travis, was there anything that was kind of like, oh, that's really awesome? And, obviously you're sharing a lot of that in the book, but is there anything extra that was like, you really got from doing the work of?
Oh yeah, like absolutely. With all the, there's a lot of things that gets thrown out on the cutting room floor, so to speak, right? It doesn't make it in the book. A lot of interviews we did, a lot of things we wrote. And actually I've started a process on my Facebook page where I'm going to be writing some of these outtakes, as I call them,
Right.
Because they didn't make them in the book because they were too technical, for example, or they didn't fit the narrative arc, or they were just such awesome stories that I wanted to share them. Like we had some extensive conversations with Doug Beal and the foundations of the National Training Center, which I thought were fascinating. And, hopefully our listeners here might like to hear it. I'll give it briefly. But back in the 70s, the Soviet Union, the communist countries, East Germany, China, Cuba, all had national training programs for their Olympic athletes. So the government, the state, would fund these training centers and fund the athletes, and they were kicking our butts internationally.
Okay.
So the U.S. Olympic Committee, which I never knew this, but Doug Beal told me, it was made up of a bunch of ex-military guys. So like generals and admirals, that's who ran the U.S. Olympic Committee for some historical reason. And they told USA Volleyball and Doug Beal, like, we're going to establish a national training center, just like the East Germans, just like the Soviet Union or the Russians now do, with one small caveat: no money. So Doug Beal, you're supposed to establish a national training center that to compete with, East Germany, Russia, France, all these things that are government supported, government paid for no money. All right. So they tried to find a city that would host them, that would give them a gym, that would provide the jobs program that the players needed. And it was a fascinating discussion because they chose Dayton, Ohio, right? All the volleyball players in the world lived in California, or most of them. And they decided to put their national training center in the middle of Ohio in the middle of winter, right? And they're not going to pay the athletes, but you can get some job if you want. That'll pay you a little bit of money, and you'll kind of be a little bit poor, and you'll be living on a floor, and you'll do it to sacrifice to go to the Olympics, right? And that was kind of the deal. And that created a lot of conflict, right? Like the players, again, they're complaining about living in Dayton. They're complaining about having no money. And well, that's the deal. You want to play in the Olympics or you not want to play in the Olympics? We have no money. And so we document a little bit about that. But the conversation that we had with Doug Beal was really interesting. He said something I found to be quite interesting from a life in sport. He said, the best players don't make the best teams, right? So that's kind of a non sequitur, which is kind of like, it doesn't make sense. Well, how do you kind of scratch your head, like, how do the best players not make the best team? And so one of the things we learned, I think, if you know the Moneyball story, right, the baseball and the statistics, is even billion-dollar franchises with multi-million-dollar, scouting budgets, it's very difficult to assess talent at the elite levels. It's very difficult to know who is going to be great, who is going to, at that moment of truth in the championship moment, win. And so the discussion we had with Doug Beal, which wasn't in the book, was, well, okay, what do you mean by the best players don't make the best teams? Well, clearly something's off. Is it that the player you think is the best player isn't actually as good as you think they are? Like statistically they might be, but they're not able to bring it when you need it in championship moment and championship time. Or is it that the player might be great, but they create so much chaos on the team? Should you keep them or should you let them go? Right. So they're affecting the other teammates, and even though they're great, what they're doing is making everybody else come down. So the combined team isn't as good. Right. And, he really struggled with that because there were a couple of players that he just were the world's best at their position that were causing these, chaotic situations in the team that they had to go through. You sort of saw that with Karch Kiraly and his, women, this Olympics. He talks about it. Now it's talked about as culture, right? And he removed a player or two that wasn't signing up for the culture that was very good. And it was slightly controversial at the time, but the results speak for themselves. So I thought that was an interesting discussion, which isn't in the book.
It's really interesting, the mindset and how people approach that, as you say, culture or team effort versus ego, and the balance of that, for sure, even on any team.
So like one of the things was, that was sort of the conversations I had with Travis, because he's a younger player. He doesn't know it, is so sports have evolved, right? Like, we talk about the party scene that occurred back in the day. Well, there was sort of like an ethos that, well, I could party hard and play hard. I'm a real go-getter. I'm tough. Like if you can't drink and play, you're not a real athlete. Like which is unheard of now. Larry Bird is smoking cigarettes at halftime of a basketball game. The Bulls would take a couple drinks sometimes before games back in the day, which would be unheard of now.
Right.
Another thing back then was, again, so they established this national training center, and it's like, you're going to practice 5 days a week all year round. Before that, they would just show up in the summer, practice for a couple of months, go play in these international competitions, including the Olympics, play horribly. Yeah. And so the players are like, well, wait a minute, what happened? Like, we just could show up. And also there was this ethos, which was really interesting, was that back to the conversation with Doug Beal, if you were the best player, you didn't have to go to practice. You didn't have to show up. Hey, do you want me to play? I'm the best player in the world. I don't need to practice. I don't have to listen to your rules. I don't have to go there. It was sort of odd back then. And that was kind of the way it was. Like, again, you don't go to practice these days. Your coach is going to, boot you. But back when I started, come to show up to the games. As long as you're the best player, you'll play. So a little bit of that is kind of interesting, the way sports has developed.
Right. Well, and I think to your point in regards to whether it's the Russians and the discipline of the military, and this is the workout, and you in the other article you mentioned just how dedicated you were to training, on the beach, in the gym, getting better, a little bit better every time about different aspects of the game, and knowing the other players and other things. So it's a lot of stuff that goes into performing at the level of success. So I think that's important for people to understand.
But it's been the same thing along with culture, along with what I said was sort of the athletes and how they act off the court, there's been an incredible change in what we know about training and training methodologies. You know, back in the 70s, they were against things like weightlifting. They thought it shortened the muscle. Okay. They thought they told us not to drink water. Okay. You don't get a water break during the game. They'd yell at us. So we're like thirsty.
Oh, man.
Oh, it was horrible. Like, yeah, like now what we know about hydration. So interestingly, Doug Beal is a movement physiology PhD. He was an academic, right? So he worked in college, and at the time, you know, as I mentioned, what these, you know, international, the Germans, the Russians, the Cubans, the Chinese, along with these national training centers, they had literally universities that were dedicated to understanding sport. You know, one of the things that came out was plyometrics. Right. And early on in my career, some of this knowledge from these, you know, these ideas about training were sort of filtering in. Yeah. You know, like I said, weightlifting, plyometrics, some, you know, now we're beginning to see like sports psychology and mindset creeping in. And we know more about the way the brain works in terms of dopamine levels and other chemicals that will benefit athletes to the extent that we didn't know that before. You know, one of the interviews was with the world famous Chris Marlowe. And he was like, when we started training year round and using these techniques, he said, this was his quote. He goes, we got real good, real fast, right? Real good, real fast. So for all the people out there, if you can find, you know, someone who's really talented in this area of, you know, working out and physiology, you will get real good, real fast. Like just one simple thing, the power systems. We used to think there were 2, aerobic, anaerobic. Then there was 3, then there was 5. And now they don't know how many power systems you have. So if you don't train the power systems correctly, you're going to, during competition, you're going to, you know, athletes on a psychological level, a very, very minor level, you'll move away from that area where you're weak and you will not be successful in your sport. So there's a lot for all you athletes out there to learn, especially if you're young. Yeah.
We can dive into that again another time.
Yeah.
Just in kind of where you are in life and the world currently, I know you're doing the finance, hedge funds, you've got your hand in the volleyball world, but like what else are you doing in regards to volleyball, and kind of, do you have any intentions, aspirations that keep yourself in that circle? That what do you want to see moving forward?
Yeah, like, so as I said, when, you know, volleyball kind of ended in the United States, and it really hasn't even gotten back to that level since. I went to business school, and you know, besides a volleyball player, I've always been interested in business and finance, and I've had interest outside of volleyball, even though I was a professional athlete. When I first started playing, I was a college student, right? Yes. I said when I was the youngest number 1, I was in school. So I'm playing in the World Championships in Rio, and I have a friend faxing me the notes for school because I have finals next week. Okay?
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I went into finance and hedge funds, and, you know, groups call me occasionally, you know, finance groups or people who are thinking of investing in the tour or investing in volleyball. And I think it went bankrupt again in 2010. And we had a group came to me that wanted to buy it, and they put a bid on it, and they had it under contract, but they decided to back out. So I don't really have much of, I'm not much involved in volleyball anymore. I mean, if you would have told me in 1996 that there'd be hundreds of women's sand volleyball teams around the world, there'd be coaches like Doug Beal, again, this is one of the things he goes, it simply astounds him that coaching is an actual career. Like he goes, I was going to coach the national team for a few years and go back to academia. Like it didn't occur to you that would be a career path that it is now. So I'm not that much into it. So one of the things that people who love volleyball and want to see it be successful sometimes miss is that the size of the sport is not very large. All right. So what you want to do is maximize how big it can be, not dream about what you would love it to be. Like everyone goes, oh, at golf and tennis, like those are big sports with big, you know, participation and tons of people coming to watch. And there's not a lot of opportunities in, say, professional men's beach volleyball, or even just professional beach volleyball in the United States. I mean, FIVB has sort of like ceded even any of their thing to the World of Volley group. They came in and have taken over operations.
Yeah.
So, I could, again, if they want me to help them grow the sport and make it as big as it was in the 90s, I could do it. It'd be very easy. It would be very easy. Yeah.
Well, maybe we'll discuss that in another episode.
Yeah, it's not hard. Trust me. Well, yeah.
So my last question for you is, what cause or mission would you like to kind of instill in the minds of our young players as they learn about these stories, as they vicariously live through that Kings of the Summer? Would you like them to kind of remember? And I think the one thing with volleyball, as I'm seeing it now, I would love to see more of our heroes being acknowledged in and amongst the production of, AVP. And I'm, got to be part of World Series of Beach Volleyball. I'd love to see that come back. What do you want the takeaway to be, or the kind of inspiration for the younger players in knowing this and knowing you and seeing this book?
So I guess I would say to the younger players is that it all starts with what I would say is called the winning mindset. Okay. Yeah. And that is, the goal is to win, period. Right. That's the purpose of sports. You're there to win the competition. Right. That's where it all begins. And so if for the young people, what I would tell them is, it might not be clear to you, is that the sports are purposely made to threaten you. They're purposely made to stress you, right? You could clearly see that in a combat sport or in a collision sport where you could be seriously injured. They're meant to induce within the athlete fear, anxiety, physical exhaustion, and other sorts of things. Pain so unimaginable you can't believe it. Like pressure, the pressure of competition. So we know that. So athletes will come to you, God, I'm so anxious. That's the point. That's what we're doing out here in the thing. And so to a young athlete, literally go for it. Go for the goal. Set your mind to say, I'm going to win. Become strong, right? Become fearless. Become courageous, right? Become calm. Become patient. Become move for face the fire and go for it. Go towards it. And it's not, you don't even have to train for it, right? You just decide you're going to do it. I will be fearless. I will be courageous. Okay. And again, it gets back to the winning mindset. That's the beginning. That's the cornerstone for you as an athlete and for those that are trying to work with him and her, right? That's the first step on the path up the mountaintop, right? And the first step is this: the goal is to win, period. And that's what I would say to them.
Awesome. I love that.
Thank you.
Very good. All right. Well, thank you so much for this time. I will put some comments in the presentation down below for other links on the book, how you can buy the book. Again, this is Laura Hendrickson and Kent Steffes from Life of Volleyball, and hope to see you guys in the next episode, and we'll see what we can drum up next. So thank you so much for your contributions to this sport and everything else, and look forward to seeing what we have for the next time.
Thanks for having me.
Okay.
It was a pleasure. Yeah.